Fire away, mate. Now, today I'm going to speak about the obvious, and that is the 100th anniversary of the First World War. I was just asked, do I wear a poppy? I don't. I don't wear a poppy not because I'm disrespectful to the dead. In fact, I've spent most of my adult life contemplating the consequences and effects and causes of the First World War.
Content over everything!
I've engaged in investigations and I've orientated my life around struggling and campaigning against what I believe is the system that gave birth to that slaughter 104 years ago, which ended 100 years ago. And the starting point for understanding the dynamics of that process is to look around us, around the world today, and to see the way in which, like over here, when I came into the park, and in the cenotaph today, and in Germany and in France and Belgium, and around the world, world leaders and former soldiers, the mass of people, stand in silence to commemorate the war. But someone on Facebook yesterday summarised up why I have become so involved in politics. When he asked a very simple question, he's a Labour Party member, and he asked, what exactly was the First World War about? And if you ask that question, you'll find a deafening silence on the part of the rulers of Europe, on the part of the ruler of the United States of America, on the part of governments, the mass media. They have no answer why the First World War happened. I tell a lie. They have lots of answers. They'll tell you there was a guy shot in Serbia. They'll tell you there was tension between powers. They'll tell you there were German dictators, or dictators in Russia, or some such story. They'll cobble together a series of events into a narrative that argues that war was an accident, a disaster that befell mankind, or a Darwinian product of man's struggle for survival, or national struggles for survival. These are all lies. They're lies that your history teacher told you. They're lies that your government tells you. They're lies the establishment tells you. Because the fundamental starting point for understanding for me is this. If I ask you first, how many people here know? Let's not start with why it happened, but why did the First World War end? Why? Come on, somebody. What? I'm asking a concrete question, not a generic question. What? Is that an answer? Was Germany conquered? When? Was it when? Where? Not true. Was Germany conquered? Where? In the Second World War, Germany was conquered. In the First World War, no German territory was occupied. So what caused the end of the First World War? Who ran out of money? My friend, why could the Germans not go on? What? You see, if I ask you what sparked the First World War, you'll answer me, right. Everyone learns that at school, at college, on television, but nowhere, and I can prove this now, nowhere do they tell you why the First World War ended. That's not an answer.
They both bankrupt. Hold on. Basically, the Germans went to the British to discuss the split of the economies in Africa.
Well,
That's one of the main reasons.
Well, but I'm asking a very specific question, not a generic question. On the 9th of November, 1918, there was revolution. A revolution in Germany. That is what ended the First World War. The sailors in Kiel on the 4th of November 1918. They were supposed to go and fight a naval conflict with the British. The sailors said, we're not fighting. We will shoot our officers. We'll throw them in the sea. We will not fight one more day for the Bosses' War. That's what they called it. The Bosses' War. Then revolution spread to the cities. Kiel, Hamburg. And on the 9th of November, the revolution reached Berlin. That led to the overthrow of the Kaiser of Germany, who, by the way, was the grandson of Queen Victoria. He was overthrown, he fled, he ran from his country. The bosses of Germany ran from the country. The generals ran from the country. And Berlin was conquered by soldiers, sailors, workers, women. They took control of the city. That is why the war ended. But why did you not know that? What? No, because the apparatus of lies is deeply, deeply ingrained in society. They want you to remember war. Oh my God, my great-great-granddad died. They want you to remember war. How sad that ordinary people died in the slaughter in Flanders. How terrible that millions died to conquer 100 foot of territory. How terrible was Verdun. How terrible was the Somme. Remember the dead, the glorious dead. But they don't tell you why they died. Firstly, why did the war end? Because the masses in Germany understood after 4 years, this is not a war of the people. This is not a war of the German people, or the French people, or the British people, or for that matter, the colonially occupied people of Africa, India, Latin America, East Asia, where Britain, let's not forget, we are told, what was the cause of Britain's involvement in the war? What was that? Why did Britain go to war?
You mean the First War?
Yes. Thank you. Belgium. But was it Belgium? Did we go to war to defend Belgium? Did we want their chocolate and their beer? Were we scared of not getting any more? If we went to war in Belgium and over Belgium, because Belgium was being deprived of its liberty, of its national independence, which it was. The Germans conquered Belgium, true. What a terrible thing, true. But then you have to ask yourself, was it therefore a principle of the British that they fight for the national independence of every nation? Was that a principle of the British? On the contrary, inside the British Army, in the trenches of Europe, we imported people from India, 1.4 million people from India imported like slaves by the British to die in the fields of Europe. They imported Chinese to build infrastructure for the British. They fought wars in Africa. They fought wars in the Ottoman Empire. The British, the Germans, what did they want? Why were the Germans fighting the war?
I thought it was they wanted an age of wonder.
What do you want?
They wanted an age of wonder. That's what they...
Where would an age of wonder come from? Where would an age of wonder come from? It would come. They used to say, you probably remember from school, they taught you, the First World War was because the Germans wanted a place in the sun. Remember that? Yeah. A place in the sun, they say. An advisor to the Kaiser said he wants a place in the sun. And then the Germans went to war to try and get one. The problem is, one sec, the problem is, when the Germans wanted a place in the sun, they found they were all taken already. Every place in the sun already had a British general, a British viscount, a British officer, a British official in charge of the countries that had the sun. And those countries, India, Africa, parts of China, Southeast Asia, those countries, were they democracies? Were they free people? Were they independent? Did we fight for the independence of India?
No.
Did we fight for the independence of North Africa, Egypt, or South Africa? We fought a war in South Africa to make them colonies. We conquered India to colonize, plunder, rob, and enslave the Indian people. We conquered parts of China to plunder, rob, and force the Chinese to take our opium. We conquered parts of South America to plunder, rob, and steal from the people. We tortured, murdered, and killed all around the world in the name of the British Empire. And you know, even today this continues, doesn't it? The Windrush scandal. Why are people from Jamaica sent back to Jamaica? Because the British imperial mindset had this idea. We rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never will be slaves. So they say. But actually, in the First World War, the reason the war happened had nothing to do with Belgium. Belgium was the excuse for the war. In fact, the war was a war of the British imperial power which controlled the planet. The sun never set on the British Empire. And the Germans wanted a piece of the action. That's all it was. That's all it was. And when they say the Germans and the British, I will qualify what I mean. Because don't forget, in 1914, there was no social services. There was no welfare state. There were no rights for the workers. The workers would be attacked, beaten, press-ganged into slave-like conditions in the factories and industries. That was the British were slaves. Slightly higher up than the Indians, slightly higher up than the Jamaicans, slightly higher up than the Chinese, but they themselves were slaves in Britain. Slaves to the capitalist industries that sought to minimize costs and maximize profits. That's what the war was about.
You know, I totally agree with you. But there's one thing as well you forgot, maybe to mention.
We haven't got there yet.
You know, this old country, Belgium.
Yeah, they had colonies as well.
Yeah, they had colonies, and before that, they discussed all of them how to split the empire.
Yes,
yeah?
yes.
And by growth of Germany, Germany was disagree how they decided to split the oldest empire.
Because the reason why Germany didn't have an empire like Britain
That's the reason
was
why.
because Germany only had a small coastal area,
Thank you.
a small navy. Britain maintained its global dominance until 1926. In 1926, the naval agreement meant that Britain lost its control, whereby prior to 1926, Britain had to have the biggest navy compared to the two next powers. After 1926, America, because Britain was bankrupted in the First World War, America took dominance of the world, and thus began the era of American imperial control that continues to today. And once you understand, once you unravel, once you unlock the secret of the First World War, you begin to understand the world we live in today. Fundamentally, there is no distinction between the world we live in today and the world we lived in 1918. None. Fundamentally, the system we live under is the same. You go to work for an employer. The employer pays you a wage. Your life begins after work, if you're lucky. Some people travel, work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, travel 2 hours by train every day. When they get home, they fall asleep. They have no life outside of the work, which is not something they choose to do, it's something they must do to live. Now ask yourself this. Now if you ask yourself, what was the Iraq War about? Was it about freeing the Iraqis from their dictator?
Freeing them from their oil.
Iraqi freedom.
Yes, it was freeing them from their oil, but that's not just it. Don't forget, when Saddam Hussein was attacked in 1990 by the Americans and the British, when they attacked, bombed the Iraqi people in the name of fighting for the freedom of Kuwait, don't forget how that comes up again. The same story again. We're fighting for the freedom of the poor Kuwaitis, who, by the way, lived under and continue to live under a dictatorship. A kingdom that rules with absolute power. Just the same as the Saudi gangsters that Britain supports. But the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's crack troops, where were they trained? Were they trained by Saddam Hussein? Were they trained by the Germans or the French? No, they were trained in Sandhurst, the #1 British military academy in the world. That's where Saddam Hussein got his special crack troops trained. Where did he get his weapons? From the British and the Americans. Because they regarded Saddam Hussein as an ally, a staunch ally, just like Saudi Arabia is a staunch ally of Britain today.
And Egypt.
And drops bombs. You see the pictures on television, don't you? Starving children in Yemen, dying by the thousand and thousand. Meanwhile, the Saudi government captures journalists, takes them in their embassy, chops them into little pieces and drops them into a bath of acid. That is the allies that we have today. Today. And then they weep their crocodile tears. How terrible the First World War. How terrible. What a monstrosity. Meanwhile, we provide the weapons. We provide the support. We provide the diplomatic defense of Saudi Arabia killing their people. We're still in Afghanistan. Still in Afghanistan. How many times has your Tommy Robinson will scream and shout, the British Army, defend them, protect them, our soldiers, our boys, monstrous what anybody attacks a British soldier. And yet Afghanistan? How many times has Afghanistan invaded Britain? Stupid question, right? How many times has Britain invaded Afghanistan? 4 times. 4 times. They don't teach you in the history books. They don't tell you that on telly. They don't say that when they remember with tears the First World War. Not a word of it. And the point being this, once you trace the connections between the internal system, its external manifestation, so the plunder of the people here, the plunder of the people in the colonies, or the former colonies through economic control, and today's world of global control by the multinational companies, 140 companies control 40% of the planet's world trade. 740 companies control 80% of the trade of the world. And within the world, half of the world earns less than $2 a day. $2 a day. Less than they would have earned back in 1914 in Britain. $2 a day, half the world. And at the same time, 8 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people own more wealth than half of the entire world's population. It is for those people, for the large companies, the giant banks. They seek to conquer the world for themselves. They are masters of the universe. They dominate our planet. And the governments, it used to be the case that governments represented big business. For example, in Britain, France, Germany, or America. Now, of course, we have a new phenomena. We have a multi-billionaire controlling the weapons of the most powerful country in the world. They have enough weapons, nuclear weapons, to destroy the planet 100 times over. And yet they want more. More weapons, more power, more control. And they tell you it's about democracy. Democracy is disposable as far as they are concerned. Democracy only exists. Only when did we get the right to vote? When did men and women in Britain first get the right to vote? Was it before the First World War? Did we vote on the war? Did we have a choice in the war as to what we did? No, no, no. There was no democracy. Or better said, only men had the right to vote. Women gained the right to vote much later, 1928. They talk about 1918. They're not telling the truth. Only middle-class women got the right to vote in 1918. The right to vote for all women was only granted in 1928. In other words, something happened during the First World War which led to an awakening. That awakening began in 1917, and it began in France. If you get a chance to look on YouTube, look up the film by Stanley Kubrick. It's called Path to Glory, and that film shows a general strike that broke out in the French army. That was the beginning of the end of the war. That's why they feared their own soldiers, because once you send them to die for a pile of mud, for shit, for nothing, to accumulate wealth and seize territory for the wealthy. How much does Britain, they say Great Britain, England, our flag, our country, you're supposed to stand in the cenotaph and wave a Chinese-made English flag and say, wonderful, long live the Queen, long live the army. In truth, the British people do not own Britain. The British people do not control Britain. The British people are wage slaves, compelled to work by economic penury for a group of capitalists, 150 companies, control 80%, 70 to 80% of the entire stock market valuation in Britain. There are 6 million companies, but only 150 control the country. They are Britain. We are not. We have just the same. You remember the story, you'll know this one. 1914, Christmas time. The British and German soldiers heard Christmas songs from across the trenches, and they carried out a revolutionary act of fraternisation. They climbed out of the trenches, they drank some booze together, they sang songs together, they played football. Germany won, 2-1. And then next year, the generals said there will be no Christmas armistice, no Christmas peace. We will continue bombing on Christmas Day. Because otherwise the danger was this. The masses, the workers, turned into soldiers to fight from mud in the interest of the imperial powers, to conquer the world and redivide the world. Those people might revolt against their rulers. There's a song from the International, it's called. I wrote the words to the second verse down today. If I can find it. Alas, alack. Yes. And it went like this, you see. I'm not sure I managed, but there was, you see, the idea existed since 1864, when Marx and other revolutionaries from all over Europe, the Italian nationalists, the Irish nationalists, the British trade unionists, the German social democrats, the French socialists, other European workers' organisations and national movements. They had a movement called the International. Their aim was very simple. We will not live, we do not hope for a national salvation. We don't hope our country will do well. Our country will show it's superior to the other. Our race is superior to the other. No, they abandoned that idea back in 1864. And the headquarters of this international was in London, in Greek Street, number 18, Greek Street. And there they created an organisation that had as its declared aim the creation of a single organisation of the working classes of the world, of the whole world. And the working classes, the bus driver in Bogota, in Birmingham, in Beijing, they are the same people. Different colour skin, different background, different mindset perhaps in something, but they do the same thing, therefore they are the same people. And that idea of global solidarity amongst the workers clarifies what the war was about. And they made this song. The first verse goes like this. It's Old English. Arise, ye starvelings, from your slumbers. Arise, ye criminals of want. For reason in revolt now thunders, and away with the age of cant. Away with all your superstition, servile masses, arise, arise. We'll change forthwith the old conditions, spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. The second verse goes like this. Interesting, in 1871, these words were written. The kings who made us drunk with fumes, peace for us and war to the tyrant. So let our army go on strike, guns in the air, let's break our ranks. If they insist, these cannibals, on making heroes of us all, they soon will find we've saved our bullets for our own generals' skulls. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. That is how the First World War ended, the people of Germany, the people of Britain, the people of Russia, the people of Bulgaria, Hungary, France, began to rise up against their rulers. Winston Churchill, having gone to what now is Iraq, and he said, let's drop poison gas on the Kurds. When he went there, he said, because it will create, gas, he said, will create a lively terror amongst the recalcitrant Arabs. Winston Churchill, the British hero of all time. An advocate of mass murder. That is the British hero. That's the, and you look around, all around London. Go to Trafalgar Square. You don't have to look far. There on Trafalgar Square, there are 4 monuments. One of them has the name Havelock. General Havelock. When you're next in Trafalgar Square, look. And it says, 1857, Havelock defeated the insurgency in India. In other words, Havelock used the British Army against the Indian people who were slaves of the British to slaughter them for demanding their rights. That is a hero of the British Empire. And everywhere. Then you go to the Mall, opposite the Queen's house. At the beginning of the Mall, on the right-hand side, you'll see memorial to the British soldiers who died. God, they died. Fighting for our country. Where were they fighting? In China. They were fighting in China in the Boxer Rebellion, to crush the Boxer Rebellion. They murdered and killed and smashed up Beijing. They ransacked the palace of the king. That's after they forced the Chinese to take opium in 2 separate wars in the 19th century. And they are our heroes. Our heroes. And so that is why, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to investigate. Investigate history, I'll take you 1 second. Investigate history not as the history of the kings and the queens, not as the history of the rulers and the elite, not the professors, the specialists, the experts who you see on television telling you Simon Sharma version of history. History, Marx explained, history is the history of class struggle. History is the history of the masses, the concealed masses, those who fought the war in the trenches, those who died in the trenches, their families at home who were forced into the factories to manufacture the instruments of war. But not only, but all over the world. The solidarity, the Germans used to say this, the borders are not between one country and another. The borders in the world are between those who are above and those below. Those above and those below. It is a class question. And as long as we live in a world where one class that owns the factories, owns the industries, owns the services, owns the land in Britain, 6,000 families own half of the country. Half. There was an article today in the Financial Times. BBC, I'm getting lost. BBC today. Look on their website. Renting in Britain. In London, a 1-bedroom flat varies from the cheapest in London of about £1,000 a month to the most expensive areas of London where a 1-bedroom flat is £3,000 a month. £3,000 a month. To live somewhere before you feed yourself. To live somewhere. And yet, how do you know the world is the same as before the First World War? How do we know the causes are the same? Because the landlord has one interest and the tenant another. The owner of the companies has one interest and the workers in the companies another. The workers want higher wages. The bosses want lower wages. The workers want more. The workers want better life. The bosses want a worse life for the workers. The bosses want increased intensity of work. The workers want less intensity of work. And how does this manifest itself? In the struggle over who owns. What is a weapon? What is a gun? A tool. What is a missile? A tool. What is a mobile phone? A tool. What is a computer? A tool. And the tools that distinguish, that is what distinguishes man from ape. Our control of the tools. We make tools. And long before there were passports, long before there were borders, for millions of years there were no borders, there were no countries, there were no nations. We conquered the world with a tool in our hand. It wasn't a mobile phone, it was a hand axe, a stone that we shaped. We learned to shape. And because we learned to shape stones, we learned to conquer the earth, to kill animals, to grow plants, to make shelter, to make clothes, to feed ourselves, to produce wealth. And that wealth, unfortunately, despite the fact that every one of you, every single one of you, comes from ancestors in Ethiopia and Tanzania 2 million years ago. That's where we all come from. And yet, even though our ancestors 2 million years ago, all of our ancestors 2 million years ago, up until today, 2 million years of tools, 2 million years of conquering nature, 2 million years of making things to satisfy the mind and the body, to make life better. Yet in 2 million years, here in Britain, here in London, 42% of the descendants in London of our ancestors from 2 million years ago have only £100 in savings. 42% of Londoners have less than £100 in savings. 60% of the British population, our war, our army, our country, 60% have less than £1,000 in savings. In other words, in 2 million years, we acquired nothing. Nothing. And that, of course, is the precondition for the maintenance of capitalism. And after the war, after the First World War ended, what happened? Did they learn the lessons? You'll have seen all quiet on the Western Front. The boots, where are my legs? And yet, even though you've seen this, still suddenly, out of nowhere, strangely, unexpectedly, emerged a new war. What was this war about? All of you will answer to a man. Adolf Hitler wanted to conquer the world, true? But who did he want to conquer the world from? Who did he want to conquer the world from? From the British. The British had an empire in 1939 that spanned the world. Indians were still slaves of the British. They used to crucify Indians on a piece of wood and lie them in the sun. The Indian independence movement, they'd put them in concentration camps. The concentration camp that Hitler used was invented by the British in the Boer War in South Africa. You wanted to say, sorry.
Yeah, basically, in 1916, after the Lord Balfour Declaration for a Jewish state, the Kaiser went to the British leaders and said, we could end the war. Because at that time, the Germans were winning the war by controlling the sea, yeah? Through the submarines. Yeah.
They tried.
No, they were. And there's basically, the Zionists said, no, we can make Britain win the war by persuading the Americans coming to this first war. So otherwise, if it was the case, Britain and Germans were about to end the war, just to finish the war. But The Zionists
understand.
persuaded Americans to come to the war and help the Britain. Because they,
I was trying to make a simple point. Not that anything you're saying is wrong. I'm not saying when they tell you the war was about this or that specific incident. Of course these things are true. True in an empirical sense. But what is underneath the surface? What underlay the process? That process is not about Balfour Declaration. It's not about the Treaty of Versailles. It's about the fundamental structure of our society and of every society in the world. The world was not controlled by the people of the world. Neither is it today. The world was not controlled. The lesson to learn is very clear. The war in 1917-18 was ended by revolution. I am not a pacifist. I do not believe you should say no war, peace. Because the rulers of the world have the weapons in their hand. They must be disarmed of their weapons. And that means that the transfer of power from the rulers to the people, from the bosses to the workers, from the landlords to the tenants, requires an act of sudden and dramatic change. That sudden and dramatic change is what we call revolution.
yeah, but the thing is this.
And the First World War can be summarized in very simple terms. It was a war of capitalism to conquer the world and re-divide the world in the interest of the ruling powers. When the First World War ended and the Indians had joined the British Army and the Chinese had been dragooned in to help the British Army and the world became a terrain of battlegrounds, the people from the colonial countries, they were not offered freedom. They were not offered democracy. Woodrow Wilson said, the independence of the nations, the right of the nation to self-determination. What happened? The Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty, what did it do? It reimposed global dominance of Britain, America, France, Belgium, and so on. Did the colonies disappear? No, they increased their colonies. It was in 1947 that Britain reached the peak of the empire. China, I'll take you 1 second. China, instead of being freed, instead of being liberated, they took over. Shanghai, Shandong was added to the Germans. The Italians, the Belgians, they all got a piece of the action. The Russians, the Americans, they all got a piece of China. They carved up the world. And then ask yourself this, when you look at the map of Africa, look at the map of Africa. There's a phrase that we used, I don't know who used it, but there's a phrase, one of the leading British figures in history, you know, in modern British history. He said, we drew lines in the sand. Look at the map of Africa. They are not maps drawn according to culture, language, tradition. They are maps drawn up by the British and the other imperial powers who said, we'll have this, you have that, you have that, we have that. That is the reason, or better said, that is the spark for many violent conflicts throughout the 20th century in Africa, Asia, Latin America. That is the history of the world. I know it's popular amongst black people to investigate their history. They have what they say, Black History Week, where people investigate their background, I can take you 1 second, their history. But in Britain, what we need is not Black History Week, although that's important. What we need is working class history, to understand the history of the mass of people that live today. Where did we come from? What happened to us? How do we change the world to become not slaves of capitalism, not slaves of landlords, not slaves of bankers, but masters of our own fate.
Thanks to religion.
How one protect oneself from what happened from the
Again?
in the communist movement that happened was horrible concentration of power.
The idea of the Russian Revolution, I agree with 100%. The reality of the Russian Revolution, however, emerged out of adverse circumstances. The people of Russia were starved in 1914, and they were driven into penury during the war when they made revolution in Russia in 1917 and overthrew the Tsar. You know what their slogan was? Why the First World War ended, I said, was German Revolution. But why did the German Revolution happen? The German Revolution happened because the Russian Revolution had 3 slogans. This is what the people mobilized behind. This is why they overthrew the Tsar. This is why they established the first socialist state.
And once again,
They said the following:
it's
we demand, one sec. They said, we demand land to the peasants, bread for the people, and peace. Peace. That is why the Russian Revolution happened. But Russia was a country in starvation. You cannot create communism out of starvation. Cannibalism, yes. And cannibalism happened in 1921. It happened in 1928 in Russia because the country was completely bankrupted by the war. It took them until 1927 to reach the level of production of 1914. 1927. It took them 13 years to get back to where they were before the First World War. And that is why Stalin could rise to power as the arbiter of control of Russia. The reason for the Russian Revolution, they created what they called the Soviet Union. What is the meaning of the Soviet Union? Soviet means Democratic Elected Council of the People. Soviet Union means Democratic Elected Control by the people over the whole world. The whole world. Lenin said, the Russian Revolution is the spark of the world revolution. The objective of the Russian Revolution was to hold power, to end the First World War, to promote revolution across the world. And it happened. It happened in Germany, in Bavaria, in 1918. A communist socialist republic was established. You know what they introduced? In 1918, they introduced the 6-hour working day. 6-hour working day, 1918. Now with modern technology, with science, with culture of today, it would have been better, in other words, for the German Revolution to have succeeded rather than the Russian. And Lenin was prepared to give up the Russian Revolution if the German would succeed. Because Germany was developed, industrialized, modern. It could create communism, which Russia could never do. That is the reason why Stalin rose to power and a new dictatorship emerged. However, even though it was a dictatorship, there were advantages. And those advantages saved our asses in the Second World War. The Second World War was actually a war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Britain barely participated in the Second World War. 60% of the German army faced Russia. 60%. And it was the people of Russia, because they were defending their land. It belonged to them. It didn't belong to capitalists. It didn't belong to landlords or to kings and queens. It belonged to the people. Industry belonged to the people. And despite Stalin, despite the dictatorship, the people fought for their country. And it really was their country. And it was their determination, their morale, that ended. No, the Germans didn't control their country. A handful of people in Germany owned Germany. Krupp, Krupp, Thyssen, Siemens, they owned Germany, not the people of Germany.
Warburg as well.
No, they did. The land was publicly owned.
Yes.
The industry was publicly owned. Not Chatham House. He wasn't part of Chatham House. Sorry, I'm not into the Bilderberg conspiracy. Well, that's not fun. One more. What was that? What's that? One sec. One sec. I just told you, in case you listened to what I said, despite Stalin, the people fought. Despite the dictatorship, people fought. I am not a supporter of Stalin. I used to speak here in 1986. And people used to shout at me, they used to say, why don't you fucking go to East Germany? You stupid communists. I moved to East Germany under the dictatorship, before the Berlin Wall came down. I joined the revolution on the streets of Germany because I believe in a universal concept that the people, the workers of the world can and must take control of their world, end all wars, end all imperial conflict, end all private banking, and establish a world under the control and ownership of the world. To establish to establish a world. Our lesson from the First World War is to fight for a world of peace, freedom, and plenty, in harmony with the ecology. That means breaking the power of the big businesses which control this world today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Very well.
Can I ask you something first? Do you agree when the Soviets, the Bolshevik movement, took power, they did bad things by seizing the lands from the, for instance, European farmers? They starved to death.
There were two different processes. One process immediately after the war, when there was a civil war and Russia was invaded by 21 foreign armies. The second thing is in 1928, when Stalin initiated what he called the collectivization and the 5-year plan. And at that time, they forcibly expropriated the peasants. And that was a wrong policy. I don't agree with it.
Yeah.
And if you check back at the time, if you check back from the time, the left opposition inside the Soviet Union, which I support their ideas, they opposed that policy and they advocated democratic control of the economy by the people and gradual collectivization, not forced collectivization. So it was a mistake.
Do you agree that this is one of the main reasons Hitler was against the communists, the Bolsheviks?
Hitler was against the communists because he felt in 1918, when the revolution happened, that Germany was betrayed by the communists and the Jews, which he felt was the same thing. Capitalists and communists and Jews are the same. That's what he said.
Yeah, but because the main Bolshevik leaders were Jewish, that's the main reason.
Lenin wasn't Jewish.
Lenin was from his
He was not Jewish.
Yeah, he was.
He was not Jewish.
Yeah, he was from his grandmother.
The truth of the matter
Kaganovich, Lazar Kaganovich.
that was not the issue. Marxism.
It is.
Marxism. It's got nothing to do
was
with the
a-
Jews.
was a
It's got
Jewish-
nothing to do with the Jews. The fact that many Jews happen to be influential in revolutionary politics
No, the main
is because the Jews were an international grouping. And they had many intellectuals amongst them. Some of them were, and they also had many workers amongst them. Many of the Jews were revolutionary communists, and others were capitalists and wealthy people, and others were workers. You were all types of, but the Jews were an international group, unlike many other people.
But they were leading. They were the leader. That's the reason
That
why.
has nothing to do with the character of the revolution. Nothing to do. There was revolution in Germany, and Adolf Hitler declared the main purpose of it in 1943. He spoke at a meeting in Germany after they lost in Stalingrad, and he said, the main purpose of my life is to destroy Marxism. Because Marxism stood for the workers, not for the folk, not for the people of a country, but for the workers of every country. That was the objective.
Yeah, but the thing is, the capitalism, the Wall Street, they supported Hitler in the beginning. They supported because
Not
Hitler,
only Wall Street, the British king supported Hitler. The British
Yes, I
establishment
agree, yes,
supported
agree,
it.
agree.
And even Winston Churchill regarded
I
the
agree.
fascists in
Yes,
Italy
I agree.
as allies.
Why? Because there's-
initially in the
because
1920s.
Hitler was a pro-capitalist. He was a
Hitler was a
pro-capitalist
pro-capitalist, yes.
against unions as well.
Yes.
Against syndicats. So it was the best way to basically enslave
Now,
all
it
the
is
workers.
perfectly true.
Yes.
It is perfectly true that a layer of the British establishment wanted Hitler to fight Russia,
Yes.
to destroy Russia, and then they
destroy
thought
the
they might be able to
communists,
make a deal. And even Hitler, at the end of the war, in his last ramblings when he was in his bunker, he discussed with his officers and so on, and he said, the mistake I made, he said this, the mistake I made is I should have supported the Muslims in the Middle East to fight, to rise up against the British. Because if that would have been done, they could have pinned the British down in the Middle East,
Yes,
and then
I
he could have been it.
Yes,
That's
I
what he
agree.
imagined.
Yeah.
But his ultimate aim, of course, of Hitler was to destroy the Soviet Union.
Yes, I agree.
And the British and the Americans, they supported that objective. They hoped, the British in particular, they wanted the Europeans to fight it out, and then the Americans would come in and conquer it, which is actually what happened. At the end of the Second World War, the Americans had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. They controlled the dynamics of the development after the Second World War, which is why we are at where we are at today. That's why we're where we are.
Yeah.
You know when Hess flew to Britain, did he want to, does Hitler know about it? Did he want to make a deal with the British establishment?
I mean, these are historical issues, specific that I don't know enough detail about to answer you. I know someone who met Hess. He was an officer in the British Army who was but I don't know the details of what Hess was up to.
My brother, one question.
Fine.
Can you tell the people a slide of the New World Order? What it does really mean?
The New World Order means the old order carried on. That's all it means.
All right.
Nothing else. It's a fictitious illusion. The old world order continues to this day. The world order that existed in 1918 continues now. Just a slightly different form. But it's this, when Tony Blair says we're fighting for democracy in Iraq or Afghanistan, he means we're seeking to conquer the world or dominate the world in our interests, or part of the world in our interests. And we do that by lapping up to the Americans. And the conflict between Britain and Europe is the same type of conflict. And the conflict in Europe is between Germany as the dominant state in Europe, France as the dominant state in Europe, and the domination of the rest of the European countries, and the banking and industrial domination of the world by European and American companies. That's what the world's about.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'll come and listen to you often. As long as you come here, instead of listening to them talking a whole lot of blah blah about religion over there, I come here and listen and getting a bit more sense.
Cheers, man. All right, see you guys later, yeah?
Content over everything. From your melody.
Come, man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
My name is Victoria Murphy. I'm a travelling showman of the fun fairs. This is my grandfather with his two oldest sons, Charles Henry Murphy, Thomas Murphy. This is my adopted uncle, Thomas Shepherd. I should think that the Lord above is my shepherd, shouldn't I? Right. Are you ready? Can I carry on? Right. Come here. This is my husband.